Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to take a look at a figure painting of my wife, Betty. So as always, I started the painting with the drawing. I draw very lightly, so it might be hard to see in the video, but what I'm doing is I'm drawing some fast, loose, long line to capture the gesture of the figure. In this case, the line from the head to the hip. Her pose creates this very elegant flow, so that is what I was trying to capture. And that's what you want to do when you are doing figure drawing, is that you want to get the gesture of the figure down first, then we start to figure out the physical structure of the body. So the top of the head to the bottom of the hip is about forehead length. To have a right proportion for the figure is pretty important, otherwise your figure might look weird and that's not something that you want. And after I get the proportion and the gesture down, I start to slow down and draw the figure a little bit more carefully. And if you watched the cat painting video that I did, you might remember when I do a drawing, I like to draw some darker marks. And I will call those the anchor point. So I'm doing the same thing here. Places like her shoulder, bottom of her hip, and her elbow, those marks are vital for a dynamic drawing because it gives it weight. And when you make those marks in the right location, they can really help the painting and give it more dynamic and punches. So I'm very excited to post and share this video with you because this is the first figure painting video that I'm sharing, and this is also the first video that I'm using 3 different cameras, and you're gonna see that when I'm start painting. As I mentioned before, I'm not a natural when it comes to drawing, so I take my time making sure the proportion and the structure are correct. Here I adjusted the position of her left arm just to make the figure more balanced. Because she was sat tilted a little bit to the left with her left arm as support. And balance is another very important thing you need to have when doing a figure. Because unless the figure is lying down, he or she will always need to balance to be able to stand or sit. If you're painting a figure in action, then that's a different story, but this is a still pose, so it needs to be physically balanced. Now I start to clean up those gesture lines, those construction lines, and start to draw the figure in a much tighter, starker lines. The final drawing needs to be very clean for the painting. Otherwise, if you have too much pencil lines, it's gonna show through and it's not gonna look good. Really trying to get this beautiful curve of her waist and her hip in the drawing. And to me, that's the most attractive thing for a woman's body, which is the curve. That's something a masculine figure doesn't have. And then her right arm and hand. Her right hand is resting on her right ankle, so her hand will follow the perspective and the form of her right leg. And here I really slow down to draw her face and her head. We are facing her back, so there's only a small part of her face is showing. So in terms of that, it's relatively easy compared to a front view, but we still need to have a good silhouette. So I just want to take this time to thank you for your support. I got quite a few emails of questions and some words of encouragement, and I really appreciate you for watching and took your time to write me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comment section below. I will try to answer you as much as I can. And I understand some questions are better to answer with videos, so I might gather your questions and do a Q&A video in the future. Finishing up the right arm and do some quick lines for the background. Now we are ready for the first wash, and as you can see, I added a third camera to this video so that you can see the palette very clearly. I do this because one of the viewers in my previous video asked me to show my palette. Well, I'm not big on color because a lot of my mixing is just intuition. I still hope this can help you for your painting and give you some clarity on my color mixing. I do apologize for the lighting changes in the palette. What happened is when I'm painting, I'm blocking the light to the palette so it becomes darker whenever I'm trying to paint and not mixing the color. I will get that situation fixed for the next video. So the first wash is just some basic skin tones. There's not a lot of value going on, just some warm and cool colors. My go-to color for skin tone is mixture of cadmium red and cadmium orange. I added a little bit of Hansen yellow to it, but I try to keep it more to the red side. You don't want to make your skin too orange or too yellow. A healthy skin color is always has some red in it because of the blood that we have. If we make our figure too yellowish, it starts going to look like zombie, and you don't want that. For the first wash, I'm using a number 14 squirrel brush. There are a few hot spots that I use warmer mixture with less water and more red. And that's the nose and most of the joint area, the hand and feet. So similar to the anchor point that I did when I was drawing, those hotter colors will attract your eyes to the areas that's needed a little bit more weight. How I usually do it is to press the brush and get the pigment and the paint on the paper. And then I extend that shade with lighter mixture or sometimes just clean water. This should be done while it's still wet so everything will blend in nicely. I usually try to paint as fast as I can during this first wash because I want to have a nice clean wash. If I'm too slow and that parts of the wash dry, I will start getting some edges that I don't want. So you'll see after I'm done with the arm and leg, I quickly go back to her body before it went dry. Now I work the wash down to her lower back. I use some cerulean blue to cool the color off all the way down to her hips. Now it's worth noting that cerulean blue is sort of a tricky color to use, so I usually just clean my brush and load up the blue and just directly putting into the wash. So the benefit of using a bigger brush like this one that I'm holding is that it'll be easier to give a nice clean wash because the wash is able to hold more water and more paint. And I've learned not to lift my brush a lot when I'm doing a clean wash like this. And I'm dropping some hotter colors while it is still wet at the bottom of her hip, just to give it some form in this early stage. When the wash is wet, it is the perfect time to give it some nice soft edge and play with it a little bit. So you probably noticed that I have a rag next to my water bucket. That's just for me to get some excess water out of my brush. I used to use some paper towels until I found it too wasteful, so I switched to some dirty cloths. They are just as good and I can just reuse them over and over again after they're dry. Some cerulean blue for the cast shadow under her hip and feet. Careful not to make them too dark, we just want a little bit hint. All we want to do is to have a little separation between the skin and the bed. I also started to use a smaller brush. This is a number 10 Kolinsky brush. It gives me a much better control of the shape I want to paint. After this is finished, I leave the painting to let it dry completely. I usually go do something else during this time. If you go back to it before it's dry, you will ruin it. So when the first wash is done, leave it alone, let it resolve itself, and then go back after it's completely dry. Now the first wash is completely dry, it should look clean, transparent, and beautiful. You can also see that it dries much lighter than when I first put it down. I will start with the face. Some pretty red color starting from the nose and the eyes. And then some cerulean blue to cool it off. So I clean the brush and load the cerulean blue separately and go directly to the painting, let the color work themselves out. It's a pretty thin mixture here, so a little bit more water. Some warmth for the lips. Then I use some clean water to soften the edges. I'm using the tip of the brush to add a bit eyelashes and eyebrow, just a tiny hint of them. Here I go back in with darker value under her chin, and I soften it again. So it's really a series of warm and cool, hard and soft edges. So I darken the mixture of the skin by adding some burnt sienna and yellow ochre. Drop in some cerulean blue right next to it. I avoid using burnt umber unless I'm mixing some very dark value, because I feel burnt umber tend to make the mixture a little bit more dirty, and I try to avoid that. Continue the darker value from her neck to her back, and keep playing with warm and cool color and soften right side of the shadow. So I took the reference photo by bouncing the flashlight off the white wall on the right, so that get this very beautiful soft lighting. So the light and the dark on the figure is not as contrasty, and that is what I like, because I think watercolor looks better when the dominant value is on the light side and not a lot of strong contrast. right? As opposed to oil, which is great for some very contrast painting. Artists like Rembrandt, Caravaggio, they have really strong contrast in their figure and their portrait. I find watercolor is not so good with that, and I want to keep the value light. Continue to wash all the way down to her hip. Let's soften the edge on the right so it has a smooth transition. I soften a lot of edges on the figure and the portrait, but it's not to say that I don't keep any hard edges. Some hard edges are necessary to give some nice structure to the figure, like the trapezius muscle and the scapula bone on the back, which I'm painting right now. A tiny bit of hard edges will really hint the structure of them. Some hint of the shadow on her waist where she's bending. Here I'm painting the shadow cast by her right arm. This cast shadow she follows the form on her torso down to the side of her hip. And I continue the shadow into her right thigh that's hidden behind her right forearm and left foot. Now some very dark value here, like the photo. If you do this while it's still wet, it will create a very nice and soft transition that's just like the photo. I slow down quite a bit to keep the shape clean. I don't want to paint the dark value over onto the foot. Making the form shadow of her spine a little bit darker here. Now the wash is dry, I paint some very dark value under her hip. This shadow area is called the ambient occlusion. This is where two surfaces touches each other and block out the light. And this little bit of shadow value really helps the figure feel that it's sitting on a surface. And if you look at your surrounding, you can find this type of occlusion almost everywhere. On to the left side of her back, you can see by the photo, the value change are very subtle. So a lot of the decisions I made are based on my understanding of the muscle and the bone structures. And that goes back to the importance of fundamental. If you want to be able to paint a figure well, you need to have some fundamental knowledge and training of life drawing. Because even if I show you everything that I do, I cannot show you what is going on in my mind, because my decisions were based on my understanding and my experience. And that's not to say I'm the master of figure painting, no. But I'm trying to say is, if you understand the anatomy and the structure, you will have a pretty good idea where to put down each brushstroke. How you can effectively define a figure by using minimum amount of brushstroke, minimum amount of detail and fiddling is very, very important. And the fewer brushstroke you can paint, the better. So the same thing here, the dark occlusion of her armpit. This is to be done while the wash is wet. Again, wet on wet creates soft edges. And this is what I want here. And seeing it paint itself is a very fun thing to watch when you're painting watercolor. Now we rapidly move to her left arm. I left some light area on her arm by painting around it, and it will give it some volume. Some really warm color for her elbow, and then work it out with the brush like that. We're not painting all the little skin fold and detail. That isn't the point of this painting. I'm not a hyper-realism painter. I just want to leave some suggestions and indications. So I felt the need to darken the left side of her back, so I go back with another wash. And also glaze over her hip area again. It's good to know where you want the shape to start and where you want it to end. So each brush stroke has a starting point and a destination. It should feel a bit heavier on the bottom because that's where the weight is. It's where she put her weight on, so it should feel a little bit heavier. This was the point that I starting to have confidence because I can see the painting is going well. I was able to model and render out the volume of her back and hip. You can feel the form turning and you can see the weight of her body. And by that, I don't mean she's heavy. She's not. Now onto her feet. Really simple, just some bit of warm and cool. I really want her hip to pop out against the feet and the thighs, but I still want to hint the shadow cast by her hand onto the foot. So I went back to the right side of the back again. Just want to glaze it over and help that part of her back come together. Her right arm is pretty much the same process. I'm hitting some hot spot with darker paint and work it out with the brush. Keep the transition soft. So I basically paint the dark area first, then soften those edges to create a soft transition into the light. So finishing up with right hand and the right foot. I'm just going to fast forward this because it's pretty much the same. Now you can really see the figure is popping off the page. You can really feel the volume of the figure. So the figure is pretty much done. I'm now doing the background, and that includes the bed sheet which she is sitting on. Just suggesting some fold and wrinkles of the cloth by some simple hard and soft edges. And it's amazing how little bit of edge and value difference can really give out so much information and describe the form. So the cloth wrinkles and folds are basically a mixture of form and cast shadows. Cast shadows have hard edges, while the form shadows have soft edges. Knowing how to use them will enable you to paint out some pretty believable cloths. Keep in mind that she's sitting down, so all the wrinkles of the cloths are converging to the pressure point, which is where she's sitting on. And those are the details that will be able to help the image to be more believable. So the background is pretty random the way I do it, but I do want to keep it mostly cool in contrast of the skin tone. This shape I'm painting suggests the edge of the bed. I felt to include that because I saw this give a very nice graphical feel to the composition. Now mixing a slight yellowish color for the head frame of the bed. And I try not to be super careful and accurate about it because it's just background, and I also want to keep it look organic and free. Really loosely paint in the bed frame. There's some nice elegant detail to it, but I also keep it light so it won't overpower the figure. Now with this subtle background, it makes the painting feels more complete. Gives a little bit more sense of depth and environment. Now the final part will be the hair. And as you can see in the photo, her hair is black with very little value changes. But even though the hair is black, I avoid just to go with neutral tint or black. I mix my dark with alizarin crimson, cobalt blue, and some burnt umber. That gives me a nice dark purplish color, which is great in this case. So it's dark enough to suggest her hair is black, but not as boring as just using black out of the tube. And I also drop in some pure cerulean blue on the top, and that it work into the dark. And that makes it a lot more interesting. And I leave out some highlight for the hair to keep it simple and graphical. Here I added the cast shadow of her hair on her face. Some cast shadow from her hair on her neck. Some final background work and we're finished. Thank you so much for watching and joining me. Please like and comment if you like this painting. If you are new to this channel, please subscribe. Also be sure to visit my website at cafewatercolor.com to sign up for my Fast Track Watercolor PDF guide and visit my store. Thank you, and I will see you next time.